Festival's Charbagh. We are delighted to introduce session 131, The Jewish Novel, presented by DainikBhaskar.com. We have Andre Asselman, Simon Sabag Monfior, Towarich, discussing Jewishness and literature with Zachary Leader. Let's welcome the panel on stage with a huge round of applause.
Shall we begin? Yeah. Yeah. Do you mind where we sit? Zachary? It's fine. Is this okay?
Yes, sure. It's your guess as good as mine. I'm sure they are.
Do you need some more? Welcome to the session on the Jewish novel. I'm Zachary Leader, the only non-novelist on the stage. Let me introduce the panel. Tova Reich was born and raised in New York and now lives just outside Washington, D.C. Her father was a rabbi, her family Orthodox, and her knowledge of Jewish life, culture, and history is encyclopedic, certainly judging from her most recent novel, Mother India, her sixth, published last year. In addition to writing novels, she's been a regular columnist for the New York Times and has contributed stories and reviews to Harper's, Atlantic, Commentary, The Washington Post, and The Wall Street Journal. The British writer Simon Sebag Montefiore, like Tova, comes from a Sephardic family, a distinguished one, wealthy, philanthropic, and of long line. An award-winning biographer and historian of Soviet Russia. He's also been a television presenter, a banker, and a foreign correspondent. He's the author of 6 best-selling novels, including the Moscow trilogy, the first volume of which, Sashenka, traces the fortunes of a wealthy Jewish family in St. Petersburg from the eve of the Russian Revolution to the overthrow of communism. Andre Asselman, the author of 4 novels, a memoir, and several collections of essays, lives in New York, but was born and raised in Alexandria in Egypt to a family of Sephardic Jews of Turkish and Italian origin. At the age of 14, he moved with his family as refugees, exiles, first to Rome, then 3 years later to New York. His most recent novel is Enigma Variations, a novel 2017. And as I believe he's at work on a sequel to his first novel, about which he talked very eloquently, I think it was yesterday, Call Me By Your Name. And so that's our panel. And I thought I'd start by asking them to tell us something about their fiction, and in the course of it, to decide whether or not they think it would be accurate to call their novels Jewish novels. So I'll start with Tova.
I think, against the advice of the sages, I'll answer the second question first. I really don't accept the label of Jewish novels. I don't think there is an equivalent label for any other kind of fiction. I don't think, if you say Jewish novel or Christian novel, let's say, or Hindu novel, it's usually some kind of religious treatise in novelistic or in a fiction form that's meant for a particular audience to teach them something. So what does it mean if something is a Jewish novel? It means that it's written by a Jew, the content is Jewish. I mean, it could be any of these things. Can a Jewish novel be written by a non-Jew? I mean, the first one that pops into my head is Deronda, Daniel Deronda by George Eliot, which has a strong Jewish Zionist component. George Eliot was not Jewish. And then I think about one other thing that I don't know if you know the novel, but the great 20th century Vasily Grossman, the Russian writer, his great work, Life and Fate, I don't think anybody would call a Jewish novel, even though he himself was a Jew. It has serious Jewish content related to the Holocaust. It has one of the, a section that is absolutely powerful of the main character, Victor Strom's mother, writing a farewell letter from Ukraine to her son. She herself is a doctor. That is part of Holocaust literature, and yet it also has the whole story of the Soviet struggle in Stalingrad against the Germans. Would you call Grossman a Jewish novelist? I don't think anybody would. I think they would call him a Russian novelist. So for myself, I do not, you know, you could call me whatever you want, but I see myself as an American, if anything, an American novelist.
Simon?
Well, I mean, I think a Jewish novel is a novel that combines a certain sort of pathos and tragedy and comedy together in a uniquely Jewish way. Can it be written by a non-Jewish person? Daniel Deronda, possibly. Is every novel by a Jewish writer a Jewish novel? Doubtful. But maybe Jewish writers just write Jewish novels. They can't help writing Jewish novels any more than they can help being Jewish. But talking of great novels, and you've mentioned a few that touched you, I think, you know, some of the classic ones, I mean, of course, Portnoy's Complaint has that perfect mixture, by Roth, has that perfect mixture of comedy, tragedy, sexuality. All those Benjamin Disraeli's novels, which are now often preposterous, but still certainly Jewish. My favorite, and you mentioned Grossman, my favorite of all Jewish writers is really, and someone who is very consciously both Soviet and Jewish, is Isaac Babel, who did not write novels, he wrote short stories, but they're very much Jewish short stories. And as for my Moscow trilogy, as the name suggests, I really think of these as Russian novels, but are they about a Jewish characters? Are the quintessentially Jewish Russian stereotypes and characters within there? Yes, of course. So I think many Russian novels are Jewish novels, many Jewish novels are Russian novels, and there's a special relationship between the two. As for what I am, whether I'm a Jewish writer, I would just say, call me by my name, and hand you over to Andre.
Andre.
Well done. Thank you very much. I have absolutely no idea what I'm going to talk about because it's a very difficult thing. I mean, let's take a simple example. Is any movie made by Woody Allen a Jewish movie? Film? And everybody will say absolutely. You could not make such a film if it weren't done by a Jew with characters. Nobody mentioned the fact that the characters might have to be Jewish, and they have to embody, if not the cliche of what everyone thinks is a typical Jewish trait, at least some characterizations that would summon up an idea of what Jewish life is like. The real issue is that we don't have a definition of what a Jewish novel is, any more than one can say of anything else, an Indian novel, or if you had a majority of writers writing today, if they were all Jewish, with about a few exceptions, nobody would bother calling the novel a Jewish novel because it's done by Jews altogether. However, if Jews are a minority, then that's a way of basically categorizing them or creating a sort of a comfortable and manageable category where you can say, okay, so and so and so and so are Jewish. They are writing with a particular inflection that one recognizes as Jewish. And finally, some of their characters tend to be Jewish, and therefore we'll call it a Jewish novel, end of story. You don't agree? Fine, we'll not call it a Jewish novel and end it there. So, I mean, I have no idea what a Jewish novel is.
Saul Bellow bridled at the hyphenate Jewish American novelist, and Tova, you seem to think this is limiting. Simon, what would you say if people said you were a British Jewish novelist? And Andre, what would you feel about someone calling you a Jewish American novelist as opposed to an American novelist?
Well, I mean, Stalin called Jewish people rootless cosmopolitans,
right.
And I glory in being a rootless cosmopolitan. I'm a proud rootless cosmopolitan, but I am a British writer. And, but I'm also, in Britain we have a particular, very different situation from you Americans, because we really are a tiny minority. I mean, out of 70 million people, we're only 200,000 Jews. So there is a special, there's a special identity of being Anglo-Jewish. And I should say, just to be kind of very timely, at the moment with what's happening with Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, we're very aware of being Anglo-Jewish at the moment. There's a strong strain of anti-Semitism that's reared its head recently, and there could be a government run by these people in any minute. So I would very proudly say I'm an Anglo-Jewish writer now.
Right.
Now of all times.
Andre?
Well, first of all, I am an American citizen, but I'm not really American. So you're already creating a category that doesn't quite encapsulate what I am. I am Jewish, yes. I do not believe in a single Jewish ritual. I do not practice Judaism. So I am Jew by inheritance and legacy, but that's it. So the hyphenated doesn't bother me because that's how I'm recognized, but it's a big mistake. But we'll go along with it. Basically, being a Jew is also, to create another cliche, is to basically go along with whatever anybody says, because it's not worth the trouble.
I see. All right. I want to ask a different kind of question. This one comes out of reading Tova Reich's Mother India, which is a very funny, scabrous, irreverent, but also somehow reverent novel. And she has her central character thinks that there is an important connection between Indians and Jews, between Israel and India. I'll just read you a couple of sentences. India and Israel are one and the same, both equally renowned for their formidable mothers and math genius sons, and over-the-top weddings and wildly successful diaspora communities and unstoppable ambition, #1 in so many realms. Coming to India was like coming home at last, returning to the true Zion. So I want to ask Simon and Andre if in their brief stays in India they have noticed any similarities between Jews and Indians.
Well, I mean, there's certainly a major difference of scale between Jews and Indian populations, that's for sure. But I had a wonderful Jewish experience in Calcutta because, I mean, first of all, I went to the South Street Cemetery, which is a British East India Company cemetery, when the British still built gravestones and tombs that were like pagodas and pharaonic pyramids and domed mosque-like graves. And then I went to the Jewish synagogue, which was built over a century later, and the Magen David synagogue. And it looks like a British railway station from the Victorian times. It's the first synagogue I've ever seen with a British clock tower, like sort of Reading Station. So that was a very interesting experience, and that was a British-style synagogue in Gothic Victorian architecture built by an Iraqi Jewish nabob in Calcutta. Right. So there was my Jewish experience in India, and I enjoyed it a lot.
I don't think there is a similarity. I mean, there are coincidences, if you wish, but you know, one has to be careful with generalizations of that nature. And no, I'm not coming home to India. It's not my home. I don't belong here. I might eventually, if I decide to stay, begin to belong. But to belong in a country, you have to spend a lot of time. And Israel doesn't feel like home either. So I don't see the similarity.
Yes.
I would like to say that this is spoken by a particular character who has this idea and doesn't necessarily encompass the truth. She is in many ways an unreliable narrator, but she does see something that is similar about Israel and India and Jews and Indians, which is related more to religion than anything else, and a kind of seeking quality, a kind of searching for something, and religion expressing itself in search for meaning, which you find in places like Israel all the time. People come to Jerusalem the way they come to Varanasi, looking for meaning, and at the same time, the religion in both cases can go crazy. I mean, they could become extreme, they could become fanatic, they could become murderous. She feels this. This is what this character, Mina, feels. Historically, she also thinks of India and Israel, and by extension, Indians and Jews to be in some way connected in recent history. Both had been controlled by the Brits until 1947-48. Both became independent nations at that time as a result of a partition, and with very, very extreme consequences, severe consequences that actually last till this day. So this is the expression of the character Mina, who is not me.
Okay.
But
okay.
She sees this, and a lot of people see this. I mean, a lot of Israelis, a lot of Jews feel a connection to India, feel a kind of kinship to India, not only historically, but just humanly, on a human level. But of course, it's a simplification from her side. But you don't feel it, Andre, so that's
I'm sorry,
all right.
do I?
You do not feel it, but that's okay.
No, I don't feel it, but it's
Yeah.
okay. I mean,
But I would like to say, I mean, in connection to you, I mean, you, in a certain sense, experienced your life as a Jew. I mean, I read Out of Egypt and loved it. I mean, I think it's a great book, a brilliant memoir. And you left Egypt because you're a Jew.
yes, I paid the price for being Jewish.
True.
That's what being Jewish is for me.
All right. Okay. You could see it that way, but yeah.
I'll ask you a different question. Start with Andre. Any Jewish novels or novelists that particularly influenced you, that you especially learned from?
Is it okay if their mother was Jewish but not the father?
Yes, that's really okay.
That's where you're going, isn't it?
More than okay. That's more than okay.
That's legally okay.
That's
Halakhically
legally okay.
Well, I was thinking of Montaigne, okay, whose mother was a converso, and therefore still recognized as Jewish, and the father was not, because the father was a big impresario in Bordeaux. And Montaigne became a very sort of powerful man and a deep thinker who essentially revolutionized the modern world, created the modern world, and in many ways the modern sensibility. But there are many, many writers who are Jewish and who did not feel Jewish. Among them is Marcel Proust, of course. And finally, one that I have always loved is a writer whose pen name is Italo Svevo, and who is famous for having written about trying to quit smoking. And his sensibility is, if anything, reminiscent of Woody Allen's. They have the same kind of sensibility. And if you want to extend the metaphor and play with it, it is a particular form of irony, which is not a happy, sarcastic irony. It has a strain of melancholy in it, wisdom certainly, and an ability to understand that if anyone has a sense of humor or a sense of irony, it's not only human beings, but God himself. If he exists, God has a sense of irony because he plays fantastic tricks on us.
Aha. Simon?
Well, mine's more obvious than Montaigne, and that's Isaac Bashevis Singer, who's bound to come up in this discussion somewhere. But I love him. He really had a huge influence on me and my novels. And I mean, I think the family Muscat is the ultimate Jewish family story. Of course, he wrote in Yiddish. He was born in Poland. One brother died in the Soviet Union. One died young in America. And he wrote his whole life in Yiddish, so you can't get much more Jewish than that. And he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, of course. But I think his family stories are just masterpieces, and if you haven't read them, everyone should read them. The family Muscat, The Man of the Estate, they're set in Poland. He writes brilliantly about Jews and non-Jews. And I think one aspect that we haven't mentioned yet, which he is brilliant about, well, there are two. One is a certain sort of mysticism and belief in sort of superstition and magic, which is part of Jewish culture from the old country, from Poland and from Russia. And the second one is sexuality. I mean, considering he writes in Yiddish and he's a man of the very early 20th century, he writes about sexuality and desire with great uninhibited, almost Rabelaisian relish. And I think that you know, he has to be the ultimate Jewish writer, if Jewish writers exist as Jewish writers, which God knows. I mean, we may never decide this one.
Right. Before I come to Tova, Saul Bellow had a difficult relation with Isaac Bashevis Singer, and a friend of his told me a great story about Singer, who came to the University of Minnesota, and a friend of Bellow's, a graduate student at the time, was assigned the task of getting him to the auditorium to give his speech. And on the way to the auditorium, Singer said to the graduate student, "You know, I want you to ask a question after my reading." And he told him what the question was. And the reading took place. And at the end of the reading, there was a sort of question period. And the graduate student stood up and asked his question. And Singer said, "That's the stupidest question I've ever been asked." So he was a very tricky character, Isaac Bashevis Singer. Anyway, how about you?
Well, when I think of Jewish writers, the great Jewish writers of fiction, novels, I also would think of I.B. Singer, Isaac Bashevis Singer. He was a great writer, and I'm interested in what you say because you are the expert in Saul Bellow, and didn't he translate Gimpel the Fool?
Yes, he did. He translated Gimpel the Fool. Singer was not known outside of the Yiddish literary world, and it was published originally in Partisan Review, the sort of New York Review of Books of its age, and Bellow was credited for discovering Singer, but actually it was a man named Irving Howe who did the discovery. Singer never asked Bellow to translate any others of his stories, which Bellow resented, and I think this was because he thought that the literary world considered some part of the success of Gimpel the Fool to be a product of Bellow's translation.
Well, I think it's also because he paid very little for translations.
Okay.
But I would like to just add a few things about great writers who happen to be Jewish. I think there's a category that we might call an Israeli writer. And if we're going to speak of writers in terms of nationality, then why not speak about them as an Israeli writer? And in that class, I would place Shai Agnon, as really one of the great writers because, on the one hand, he is extremely immersed in text. So those who read him, especially if you read him in Hebrew, you can just get the pleasure of connection to text. And he's incredibly sophisticated in the European way as a writer. I think he's really incomparable. I mean, you know, nobody like him. Nobody is like him. And another writer, one of my favorite, is also Sfevo. And I would say that I feel his Jewishness, actually, to a degree in his writing, in terms of an enlightened Jew, a sophisticated Jew, an ironic Jew. A lot of the humor, I mean, the brilliant humor in Sfevo, I think that's sort of a trait that is often connected with being Jewish. I mean, I don't know what you think, Andre.
No, I see. That's the thing is, I don't want to root it in Judaism because he was a very westernized Jew, and I don't think he practiced his religion.
No, he didn't.
I think that James Joyce knew more about Judaism than did Sfevo. I mean, it's one of those things. I mean, then James Joyce becomes Jewish too because he wrote the ultimate Jewish novel. Ulysses, you know, because the main character is Jewish and it goes on for 700 pages. How more Jewish can you be?
Well, Henry Roth, the novelist who's best known for his novel Call It Sleep, was outraged when people suggested, as Andre did, that Ulysses is somehow rather a Jewish novel and that Leopold Bloom was Jewish. And this little passage, he says, how can Leopold Bloom be Jewish? A Jew without memory, without wry anxiety, exilic insecurity, not merely oblivious of his heritage, but virtually devoid. Nothing about the Kishinev pogrom, nothing about the pork kidney. Was he not bothered about the pork kidney? He says, no recall of Friday candles, no recall of matzah. Jesus, what kind of a Jew is this? No Heder, no davening, no Yom Kippur, no Purim, no Homan Toshen, no Brucke, no Hebrew, no Yiddish, or not but a negligible trace. And despite the lack, Joyce daring to depict the Jews in, quote, stream of consciousness, the inner flow of a Jew's psyche. What unspeakable gall that took. Gall and insufferable egotism. Gall and ignorance.
Gall, yes. Genius, certainly. And who is Henry Roth to talk about James Joyce? I mean, seriously. I mean, he wanted what? The typical cliche Jews from the shtetl? Would that have made him happy?
Right. What Bellow called shtetl shtick.
Yeah, I mean, that's a silly vision of what a Leopold Jew is, because Jews happen to be differentiated among themselves. And Leopold Jew is as good a Jew as any other Jew.
But no exilic
why should it be exilic?
Anxiety, no memory, no...
Do you know something? Talking of the Kishinev pogrom,
yes,
as we are, and talking also of being the feeling of being created as a Jew purely by the feeling of being rejected as a Jew or leaving a country, as you discussed in your leaving of Egypt, right. your almost biblical leaving of Egypt. My family were actually really became British because we left after the Kishinev pogrom, and they bought tickets for Ireland from the captain of the ship, and they went on the ship hoping not to go to Ireland, in fact, but they wanted to go to New York, and they bought tickets for New York, and when they'd been on the ship a couple of days, they were thrown off the ship. And they said, but this isn't New York. We can't be in New York. We've only been in the boat for 2 days. And the people carriers, the people smugglers said, look at your tickets more carefully. Your English isn't very good. Have a look at the tickets. And they said, it says New York. And they looked at them and they said, no, it says New Cork. And they were thrown off the ship at New Cork. And they had to go and live in a place called Limerick. Limerick, which is a terrible place. And they lived in Limerick for only 6 months. In a little street called New Jerusalem, inevitably. The whole boatload settled in one street. And after a very short period, the local priest gave a sermon on a Sunday, this is in 1904, and said, go from this church and throw out the Jews and drive them from Limerick. So they went to the street, New Jerusalem, and they threw them out. They broke their windows, they beat them up. And so my family left Ireland. And that was the last pogrom on British soil, 1904. And that's how we came to be British.
Right. Yeah.
That's the year of James Joyce, isn't it?
That's right.
1904.
I wanted to ask another question. What about Jewish stereotypes? How does their presence in the world in any way inhibit you when you are writing about Jewish characters? Has that ever occurred to you?
I can speak about a moment during an interview earlier this year. I was sitting next to the director of Call Me By Your Name, and a lady stood up and asked a question when it came to the Q&A, and she said, how can you pretend that Armie Hammer looks Jewish? Because he is Jewish in the film. And of course, because he's tall, he's lank, slim, well-built, handsome, blue eyes, totally Aryan-looking. And of course, the lady was complaining that he could not pass as a Jew. And of course, the director said, but he is Jewish. So, I mean, if you want the stereotypes, yes, they're all over the place. And the last thing I would like to do, just as I wouldn't want to do a stereotype of a Christian or a Muslim, is to sort of come up with all the typical cliches that you have in order to convey to the reader the realistic portrait of what a Jew, a Christian, or I just don't believe in it, and which is why I don't believe in a Jewish novel by its definition.
Right. I didn't come up with this topic.
I
by the way.
know. But I just said we will never be able to build a portrait of what a Jewish novel is.
Simon, did you, in your writing about Jews, including about a wealthy Jewish banker and so forth, were you at all aware of or inhibited by an audience that might well have these preconceptions about Jews?
No, I wasn't actually. I just tried to imagine how these people would have been. It was a special. My books are really about a Jewish family in Soviet times, but they begin in Petersburg before the revolution, and there were very wealthy Jewish families that were allowed to live outside the pale of settlement. Most Jews couldn't live in the cities, in Moscow or Petersburg, but only Jews who were extremely wealthy, and they always had a sort of moniker like Polyakov, the railway king, or they had to dominate some industry in order to be rich enough to do this, and many of them were in the controlled railways, and so my characters come from one of these families, and of course, in those circumstances, they remained sort of Jewish, but they were desperate to seem more Russian than the Russians. So I was only aware of it in the way that I imagined that they would be aware of it, and I should just say that you mentioned my family, Montefiore family, and my ancestor Moses Montefiore, who actually traveled twice to Russia to see the Tsars, to intercede for the Jews. I mean, obviously, he rose up in British Victorian society, which was an extremely snobbish milieu, and he was very good at dealing with any of the anti-Semitism or the use of stereotypes. And there was a famous occasion when he was at a dinner, and he was the only Jew, of course, and there was a lord there who sort of banged his glass for sort of silence. And he said, funny to see you here at this dinner, Montefiore, among all these lords and princes. I wonder how you got here. I'll tell you something. I've just been in Japan, and you know, Japan is a country that has no Jews and no pigs. And he said, and that's why I love being in Japan. What do you have to say to that? And there was a long silence, and everyone looked at Montefiore. And Montefiore said, well, in that case, you and I should visit Japan so they'd have one of each. So that was a good way of dealing with it.
Exactly.
Very
Tova, do you have any thoughts about this?
You know, I'm a satirist in a lot of my writing, and so to the extent that I deal with stereotype, it's basically to satirize it, when the satire is basically sitting on top of a kind of dark, tragic sort of pool of something or other, and it's only used, basically. I don't believe in it. I don't believe that Jews, I mean, there are Jews who sometimes fulfill some sort of stereotypical idea of a Jew, but I don't believe Jews are different from other human beings. So, you know, I simply do not use those stereotypes in any other way except satirically.
So none of you ever were troubled by the thought, is it good for the Jews?
Never. On the contrary, in my case, I've only written things that are bad for Jews.
I see. Okay.
And I've been criticized for it, actually, and had to deal with those.
Had to
problems.
defend, yeah.
Yeah.
I have another question, sort of an inevitable question, but a New York intellectual who's not much known now, named Lionel Abel, wrote a memoir called The Intellectual Follies, in which he described going to the cinema with his mother in 1946, well over a year after the German surrender, and seeing a newsreel for the first time of the American soldiers entering Buchenwald, and seeing these tractors or bulldozers bulldozing naked, emaciated corpses into ditches and so forth. And he walked out of the cinema with his mother, and just a couple of sentences, he said, it was an unforgettable sight, and what my mother said to me when we left the theater was, I don't think the Jews will ever get over the disgrace of this. She said nothing of the moral disgrace of the German nation, only about a more than moral disgrace, and one suffered by the Jews. Or how would they ever get over it? And Abel says they got over it by succeeding in emigrating to Palestine and setting up the state of Israel. So my question is, what do you make of this idea, and of what it might imply about the experience of diasporan Jews versus those of Israeli Jews, and also connected to this attitudes towards Israel?
Well, there is a sort of I don't think it's 100% true. Certainly not in my experience, but there is an accepted common thought that Jews who went through the Holocaust did not talk about it because they felt ashamed, and shame is tied in with disgrace. They felt ashamed that it was possible to treat them in this way, that is, to take them out of their homes and do whatever happened to them. So in a sense, it was a disgrace. They didn't fight back. And when Jews became empowered, in the U.S. at least, in the periods when a lot of groups were empowered through what was called at the time, still called identity politics, and also through succeeding, then they began to talk about it, and also to a large extent to use it. I mean, to use the Shoah and the Holocaust to their benefit. I wrote one novel about it called My Holocaust, in which is a satire on the abuses of Holocaust memory and how it's basically used for various reasons, for fame, for glory, for wealth, and so on. And not only by Jews, but by non-Jews who think it's pretty good to have something so terrible happen to you, because there are a lot of benefits you could get from it.
Yeah.
So basically, that's how I see it.
Andre, does this sense, you talked about shame in quite a different sense when you were talking about Call Me By Your Name.
Well, no, I'll stay on the subject of Judaism. I think that when something awful terrible is done to you and you survive it, you're ashamed that it was done to you. Even though you did not participate in it, you are ashamed that it was done to you. And the typical example is of a child who was beaten up at school by the school bully, who will not report it to his parents because he is ashamed of what happened to him. When in fact he should not be ashamed of it. In fact, he should report because there was an offense that was done to him. The person who should be ashamed is the perpetrator of the violence, not the person who is the victim of it. But that's not how the psyche works, I think. And so, yes, there you are mortified and humiliated by what was done to you, as opposed to seeing that humiliation happen to the person who did it to you. And I think that stays with you, if I may generalize, for your entire life. You never forget it. The violence that was done to me when I was a kid in school, the beatings and so on, by the teachers and by the other students, I'll never forget it. I will never forgive it either, but I have never spoken about that to my parents because I was ashamed, not because I was ashamed of not having fought back. I was ashamed because I received that humiliation.
Simon?
Well, I think we've said a lot about the Holocaust, and I think all one can say about it, perhaps, is just that, you know, obviously something so colossal is always with us. We mustn't forget it, but we must be very careful not to be formed by it as well. And I think that's all we can really ask in this question. But as for that thing of like, is it good for the Jews? Or, I mean, my mother used to often say to me like, don't do this, or they'll say Jews don't, you know, it'll be bad for the Jews. So my mother really was one of those Jewish mothers that used to actually say that quite regularly.
Right. Well, we...
Don't do very well at school, because if you do too well at school, they'll say you're Jewish.
Before we open it up for questions, I thought I'd just do this most dangerous thing, which is to tell a joke and ask whether or not you think this is a Jewish joke.
Okay.
It's a joke that Philip Roth told his girlfriend, who then put it at the beginning of her novel, Asymmetry, which has a character sort of transparently based on Roth. To understand the joke, you have to know that people who grew up in Jewish Yiddish-speaking families pronounced their W's as V's. So Wednesday was Wednesday, and weddings were weddings, and so forth. The joke goes like this. Let's see, I'll get it exactly the way it's written. A man flying into Honolulu says to this guy, the guy seating next to him, "Excuse me, how do you pronounce it? Hawaii or Hawaii?" "Hawaii," says the other guy. "Thank you," says the first guy. And the other guy says, "You're welcome." Okay. The novel goes on to say, the writer crossed his legs and folded his hands in his lap. "What do you think?" he asked his girlfriend. Well, the girlfriend says, "Is this a Jewish joke?" And the writer says, "What do you think?" "Well, is that a Jewish joke, and why?"
It's an okay joke. It's an okay joke. It's not. It's kind of a Yiddish joke, I would say, more in the realm of a Yiddish joke and particular type of pronunciation. But I guess you could call it a Jewish joke.
Andre, what do you think?
I think it's a joke, but it's a kind of joke that only a Jew can tell another Jew.
I see. That sounds like a Jewish joke to me.
But that's what I was going to say. I mean, that's sort of what I was going to say too. I was going to say, like, the trouble with sort of race-based jokes or only Jews can tell Jewish jokes, basically, and only Jews are allowed to laugh at them. So I think people should just scrap Jewish jokes altogether.
Okay. Well, we have some time for questions, and people will come by with microphones. This man here in the front row.
Thank you so much. Among many things, you referred to Jews coming to Palestine, and much of the discussion happened around Holocaust. Now, along with engagement with Holocaust in literature written by the Jews, now has there been a simultaneous engagement with the Holocaust that happened in Palestine? Many lives were destroyed, and what kind of engagement has been? And since in Palestine, both Jews and Arabs live, and whether in terms of humor or joke, is there a kind of commingling of humor and jokes between Arabs and Jews in the space of the Palestine?
I don't know. I know, but I don't know the answer to that one.
I'm afraid I
can't answer that, but I didn't quite understand what the question was. If there are jokes?
Are you saying that what happened to the Palestinians is no laughing matter? I think we'd all agree.
In Palestine, there was a killing of genocide of people in Palestine, and my query is that the Jewish writers who write about Holocaust, also some of them have they also written about the genocide, the killing of the innocent people in Palestine, which was linked to the genocide and Holocaust.
Tova, have you?
Well, I think you're talking mostly about Israeli writers, not Jewish writers. Israeli writers who have written about the struggle between Palestinians and Israeli Jews, Israeli Palestinians or Palestinians who are not Israeli, and the struggle between them. And sometimes there are jokes. David Grossman, the late Amos Oz, they tell jokes, yeah. And Palestinian writers also tell jokes. I mean, it's just part of the deal.
Back there, the woman in the sunglasses.
Thank you. This is an us too question, and I wonder if you could add to this list. The first woman of Jewish descent who was a Nobel laureate, Nadine Gordimer, the American writer Cynthia Ozick, the American writer Anita Diamond, the American writer Alice Hoffman, and the list goes on. I haven't heard the names of any women other than you, Tova. Thank you for your work. And I wonder if you could please add to that list.
Oh, really? Oh, God.
To add to the list, I mean, the most distinguished of the women writers in the U.S. who are Jewish now is probably Cynthia Ozick, whom you mentioned, and who would be included in what became the triumvirate that effectively brought about the phenomenon of the Jewish writer that included Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, and Bernard Malamud. And the other one would have been Cynthia Ozick. And I mean, you know, there's a bunch of writers who are women who are writing all the time. Without any kind of touching on whether I admire them or not, or whether I consider them good. I'm thinking of Rebecca Goldstein. I think of Dara Horn, Tova Mervis. There's a bunch. Women who are Jewish are writing novels, often on Jewish themes. And we didn't not mention them for any reason. We didn't mention Malamud. We didn't mention, Roth was only mentioned at the end, and Bellow, because we have the Bellow man here. So.
Yes, in the front.
I just wanted to comment on some of the things you guys mentioned about if there's something that binds the Indian and the Jewish mind, and I actually think it does. I think we are both very, very expressive cultures. We talk like crazy. We discuss everything. Our day-to-day lives are full of, conversations and arguments that I haven't seen in other, just the sheer number of words per minute that we are spewing out. It's just, there's so much conversation that goes on. So I think there's actually lots in common. And I wanted to let Andre know that if you decide to move to India, we'll take you and make you our own.
So you're not going to except that a Jewish quality is to be talking a lot.
No, but I think that if you take Spaniards, Italians, French, Germans, Armenians, Poles, everybody, they all discuss ad infinitum. They fight among themselves. They have geniuses and Nobel laureates among themselves. We're talking about. I wouldn't like to isolate Indians and Jews and then make just sort of parallels between them. You're leaving out the rest of humanity. The fact that people love to discuss and are spiteful, shameful, and all those other traits that we didn't name, they're there everywhere. And if you read any Dostoevsky novel, you'll find that the characters, the more embittered and spiteful they are, the more sometimes they sound actually like your prototypical cliche Jew.
So you don't think there are any more reserved cultures than others?
No, I think
No.
I don't. No.
Any other? Yes, over there, the man on the end. Yes. I'm sorry, you have to run all the way over to him.
Where is the man at the end?
Hello.
Hello?
I just want to mention only one thing, that God has not made two things. One is poor and other is racism. God has not made. It is man-made.
That's not a question.
Well, thank you. It's not a question, but many of us would agree. Yes, here in the front. The woman in the front with the more sunglasses.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm questioning your reference to shame rather than pain. My mother was a Holocaust survivor. I think she didn't talk about it because of her pain and she didn't want to inflict that on us. So I don't agree that it's shame. I think it's pain.
Well, Abel was not talking about a Holocaust survivor. No. He was talking about people whose ancestors, whose relatives and so forth were like this, and who felt shame that that this happened to the Jews, that this was able to happen to the Jews. So it's different from, I think, your mother. Or
You're talking about your mother. Your mother is one person.
I'm talking about just.
But you can't speak for the entire community. I think Andre is correct that there is a sense of shame when somebody is able to, in many ways, humiliate you or torture you. And I agree with you also that to evoke the pain that one suffered is also a reason people don't talk about it. And I think you're correct to add that to the conversation.
well, there are three of you back there. The middle one. Let's have the middle one. Yes.
Hi. So, Mr. Rasaman, yes.
There you are. Yes.
Right. In Call Me By Your Name, one of the prominent themes that features is this feeling of solidarity between two Jews, which sort of helps them open up to each other. So I was wondering, and any of you can answer, if in your personal and professional lives, how has interacting with other Jews and sort of sharing experiences helped influence your craft?
Influence my what?
Your craft.
My craft. No, I don't think it has. I don't think it has. I have a lot of friends who are Jewish and just as many friends who are Catholic. And I have very few friends who are Protestant, but that's not by choice. It's just that's how it happens. I don't think that I don't make a selection based on your religion, or I don't feel a particular affinity more for one group than another. I happen to have a lot of friends who are Italian, and I love speaking in Italian with them. And, you know, I don't want to pass for a sort of a total generalist who doesn't belong somewhere. But on the other hand, not having a real sort of rooted nationality allows me to basically break down all the doors and open all the windows so that, in fact, anybody can come in. And I learn from everybody. I learn from absolutely everybody.
Woman in the orange scarf.
Yes.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for such. This has been my favorite panel in 4 days. But I'm so sorry, I don't have a question, I have a comment. I beg to differ about comedy, about Jewish joke only being told to Jewish, can only be told to a Jewish person. I'm a New Yorker, and I beg to differ. As an American, most of our humor was shaped primarily from great Jewish thinkers, comedians, and thank God for Jewish writers and comedians in America. It shaped us culturally, as well as, you know, on the comedic bend and in writing and literature. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, but
Right.
yeah, I do too. Yeah.
I think we have time for perhaps 2 more questions. Yes, over there. I'm going to make the poor microphone person run.
In one sentence, I would like how life is viewed by Jews. I give an example of a prominent Indian literary giant, Sri Aurobindo. He says that life is a prison house. How you view the life?
I'm sorry, I didn't really understand. I couldn't tell what you're saying. I think we better take one more question. Yes, there. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear it properly.
Thank you. Good morning, sir. Sir, I seriously didn't understand why Hitler hated Jews so much. I mean, sir, I read books and I even read Mein Kampf, but I still didn't get it why he killed 6 million Jews out of, why so much hatred, sir? Thank you.
Our historian answer this. Simon.
Well, that's a bit of a large question, for we only have 7 seconds to answer it. 5 seconds, but obviously no one can understand that. No one can understand that.
Oh, but you can turn it into a joke if you want.
Yes.
And the joke stares at us in the face. You don't understand why? That was a joke, okay?
I'd like to thank our panel for coming and thank this very receptive audience.
Thank you.
And go off and read what some people might call Jewish novels. Thank you.
We wish to thank Andre Asselman, Simon Sebag Monfior, Tova Reeg, and